We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
The war in Israel appears to have drawn battle lines among those who once saw themselves as friends and neighbors. Or has it? And is it possible that all this conflict has done is pull back the veil on deeply held beliefs that existed all along and has ultimately made a mockery of the idea of shared values? Welcome back to Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. I'd like to take a moment to say a brief thank you to our listeners out in Pasco, Washington on KONA 610 AM. We appreciate you. Remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. Are we witnessing a world given over to blind hatred of Jews as it was 100 years ago? Well, that's the very question asked in a recent article on LibertyNation.com by our first guest this week, Liberty Nation's senior political analyst and longtime host of this here radio show, Mr. Tim Donner, who joins us now. Welcome back to the show, Tim.
Thank you, Mark. Good to be here.
So, Tim, you wrote a fascinating piece that it seems to me asks questions that other news outlets, I don't know, maybe they seem too afraid to ask, or as if giving voice to such a question will give that question strength. And you asked that in the wake of the Hamas attacks and the worldwide spread of pro-Palestinian and, let's be honest, pro-Hamas rallies and mobs, whether we might be seeing a return to 1930s Germany mentality. What's the answer to that, in your opinion, Tim?
Well, I think it's frightening enough that we even have to ask the question, that the question is even valid, but it is. Are we seeing the 1930s all over again? Well, we're seeing an anti-Semitic wave rising across the world. We're seeing it in the United States on college campuses where one Jewish student after another says they're literally afraid to be on campus. We see it with vicious protests, even in places with large Jewish populations like New York. You see the excuse making for Hamas that they're an occupied people and therefore they have a right to defy the occupation of the Israelis. But I think that bad enough to ask the question about whether it's the 1930s all over again. The problem is that you cannot answer in the negative with any confidence, because what we're seeing now is exactly what we saw rising in the 1930s when a megalomaniacal dictator in Germany started concentration camps for those who he felt did not fit the mold of the world going forward, dominated by the Aryan race. We are seeing frightening similarities to the 1930s. And I'd like to think the answer is, well, Mark, this is pretty bad, but I think it can be contained. I don't see it being contained because it's across the world. It is about deeply embedded hatred for Jews that goes back to biblical times. But if you just want to look at the last 100 years, to see what's happening now has to be particularly chilling to anybody who lived through the 1930s and were witness to what American soldiers saw when they liberated concentration camps in Germany after the war. They were beset with horror and disbelief at what they saw. And what we saw in northern Israel and in southern Israel, really all through Israel now, the type of inhumane brutality, beheading children, setting entire houses and families on fire, sticking children in ovens. Okay, this stuff is all reminiscent of the 1930s and 40s as Germany and the Nazis began their march on the rest of Europe. So I wish I could say, no, Mark, this is not similar, but it is chillingly similar.
You know, that Professor Jordan Peterson, he, and I hope I'm not mischaracterizing what he says here, but I believe he spent a large portion of his life and career trying to understand how people can get involved in an evil movement like the Nazis in 1930s, and how we we say we would never be in that kind of thing. We're too morally advanced, and yet I look around the world today and I think, well, maybe he's got a point that we're kidding ourselves if we think we're beyond that kind of stuff. Now you highlight that, and this is a very interesting point, I think, that formerly respectable news outlets appear in a hurry to publish nonsense that makes the Israeli side look bad, but are hesitant to label Hamas as anything other than freedom fighters. And take, for example, the hospital bombing, with 500 dead, apparently 500 dead. The place like the New York Times blamed on the IDF, and based on, and here's the very telling point, based on reports from Hamas. And I'll let that little nugget settle for a moment. As we know, I
Right.
think,
They did
yeah,
it based, their reporting was based on essentially news releases from the terrorists
yeah,
who had slaughtered hundreds of innocents. Actually, 1,300 was a total number.
but
At that time, in the most barbaric uh, kind of fashion.
yeah,
Uh, and the New York Times, the Pied Piper for all media on the left, rushed out with a report that the Israelis had fired on this Gaza hospital. And what they did was they set loose the kind of undiluted anti Semitism that we see rising, not just in the Middle East and not just among Muslims, but here in the United States
mm,
among naive, gullible kids who are being led down the primrose path by neo-Marxist professors on college campuses who are taking the side of Hamas, and let's say Hamas, not the
mm,
Palestinians. They try to drape their sympathy for this attack on being pro-Palestinian. But I can tell you that Palestinians are humans too, and they don't support broadly what Hamas has done. They don't support this kind of savagery. So, uh, at the same time, I will say that even if the New York Times hadn't been so anxious to immediately blame Israel for that hospital bombing, which turned out to be patently false, probably uh, a misfire from Islamic Jihad from within Gaza was what we found out. But if
mm.
they hadn't misfired on that story, as that missile had misfired on the hospital, uh, the left and Hamas and the pro-terrorist sentiment around the world would have found something else to
Absolutely.
find as an outrage. You know,
Well,
so you can't simply blame the media, but they made it so easy.
well,
By
let's.
I thought the New York Times. I'll tell you what. When I was growing up,
Mm,
Mark, reading the New York Times, I always thought of them as being distinctly pro-Israel. Not
yeah.
anymore. Not
Well,
anymore.
that brings us to politics very clearly, I think, and it's almost exclusively on the progressive left who are holding the rallies outside Capitol Hill, for example, in favor of Palestine, which really, in this case, you guys is in favor of Hamas in many ways. At that point, it was certainly.
Yes.
But you have squad members, and I think this is an important point, who
Mm.
have towed the line for every single Joe Biden policy and proclamation since he came to office without saying a single word against him. And yet, on this particular issue, the Jews fighting for their existence in Israel, these politicos, they're willing to go head to head with their own president and say they
Yes.
and their constituents won't support him for re-election unless he bows to their demands. Now, this seems to me that that's a hatred beyond politics.
Well, it is because it's a deeply, again, the squad tries to parse their hatred of Jews by saying they're just anti Israel, they're
Mm,
anti Zionist, so to speak, but they're not against Jewish people per se. But I think if you look at these protest demonstrations, like the one at that Russian airport where a mob of Muslims tried to descend on Jews getting off a plane from Israel, you can see it goes far deeper than just opposing the political settlement that created Israel. I mean, they're trying to gaslight us. This is the most classic case of gaslighting I've ever seen, Mark, where they're trying to say what we didn't see, what we saw, we didn't really see. The savagery really didn't happen. These are people, Mark, many of whom deny that the Holocaust even happened. There's many that say it was exaggerated, but there's a solid number of people within this pro-Hamas community, shall we say, who believe that the Holocaust was not just exaggerated, but actually never happened. And the reams of photographic evidence of the savagery was all what created out of whole cloth, right? This is how evil and insane and out of touch with reality the Islamist movement writ large is across the world. And when I say Islamist, I mean Hamas, Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad, and all the other organizations who may have internal disputes between themselves, but all agree on one thing, that Israel needs to be wiped off the face of the earth.
And we'll be back with Tim Donner after this short break discussing the political implications of what he's just been saying. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Don't get caught up in the media madness. Join our movement for free thinking and free speech at libertynation.com. Publishing news and analysis 24/7 with original articles by our team of authors who tell it like it is. Join us each week for online TV shows, The Uprising Podcast, and Liberty Nation Radio. We believe in free thinking and free speech. We are libertynation.com.